one of the consistent problems for both sides, is that they have both taken such heavy losses in sort of established pre-war formations that had the longer term training and the officer, sort of mid-rank officer sort of cadres to conduct large-scale brigade or division-scale operations. Both sides have very much very much lost that capacity, and so what you're seeing is that both sides are operating essentially mostly in augmented company scale groups, which is a couple of hundred men, and that's partly why you've seen such kind of incremental positional attritional warfare. So again, going back to the question of have the Russians managed to build up a sufficient reserve of new units, and have they managed to get the breathing space to train units that can fight at a larger scale? Because that's what you need to do a big kind of concentrated offensive to try and essentially break through the lines and then maneuver to expand and exploit that, as the Ukrainians did in Kharkiv in autumn 2022. So the Russians, because they've continued to take incredibly heavy losses for most of the beginning of this year, even though the Ukrainians were very short on ammunition, the Russians were only really able to push that strategy of just pressure with these relatively small-scale infantry and artillery attacks, in terms of small-scale infantry units with lots of artillery, all across the line. They didn't really have the capacity to do like a big, concentrated push. That may have changed.
I want to come on to the situation with Ukraine's air defences in a moment, Justin, but just on what we may see from the Russians in the coming months, if they were going to launch a new concentrated offensive somewhere, where do you think they would be targeting? Where are the likely areas they will target?
I mean, the immediate Russian objective is likely to be to complete the conquest of Donetsk and Luhansk, which would mean pushing towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. And one of the reasons the Ukrainians are fighting so hard to try and keep Chasiv Yar is that, first of all, it's a very well fortified position. It has high ground. It is a very commanding position. So they don't want to lose it. But also, if it falls, then significant towns and larger towns will come within Russian artillery range. And the Russians have consistently pursued a policy of essentially trying to depopulate the towns that they can. So they just indiscriminately fire artillery into towns to force the population to leave, because that further hurts Ukraine's economy. It creates more internally displaced people. It's obviously demoralizing. And so part of what's driving where the Ukrainians are choosing to try and hold and fight at different points in the front line, not only in places like Chasiv Yar where they have good ground that they want to try and defend, but also often in places where it's really not optimal to try and fight there. It's because they're trying to avoid the Russians getting into position to be within our regular artillery range of additional towns, which or in small cities. It's the Russian push is likely to at least initially be towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. And the initial stages would be trying to take key points like Chasiv Yar that would unlock parts of that. On the other hand, there is always the danger that the Russians, in a relatively small-scale attack, manage to find a weak point in the line and just push through it and then exploit it. We've seen on both sides throughout the war that sometimes, because of, for example, bad rotation handover of units, or just misallocation of resources relative to intelligence on where the enemy is planning to conduct attacks, that you get these sort of relatively unexpected breakthroughs, which, if they can be rapidly exploited before the other side has a chance to plug the gap, as it were, to move forces around, then can actually become a much bigger movement in the lines, particularly if key ground lines of communication start being taken, so key railways, key roads. A lot of Ukraine is very arable, forested in some areas, and so in many cases, lots of the country is not easily traversable at speed by armies, and so key road and rail routes are kind of a subtlety which you don't necessarily see on just a territorial map. But if key bits are taken or at least put under fire and observation, then that can really affect the ability to move things around large areas up front.
Belgium has agreed to deliver 30 US-made F-16 fighter jets. Do we know when they will arrive? And when they do, how much of a difference will the F-16s make, Justin?
So there have been some suggestions from Denmark, for example, that F-16s may be delivered into country in the next month. Certainly the first sort of class of Ukrainian pilots, I believe, are through F-16 conversion training now. The question will be on the ground support capacity. So where do you put the aircraft? F-16 requires long, comparative to the MiG-29 and Sukhoi-27 aircraft that the Ukrainians have been flying up to now. F-16 with a combat load requires long runways, but also crucially runways and taxiways that are very smooth and that are completely clear of gravel, stones, any what we call foreign object debris, FOD. Because it's a single-engined aircraft with an intake positioned underneath, right next to the ground, which, because of the shape of it, when the engine is at takeoff power, so high power, it creates a sort of very, very strong, almost Hoover effect. So it will suck up any FOD that's on the ground. And because it's a single engine, if you get engine damage because of ingested stuff on takeoff and an engine failure, there's no second engine, so you'll lose the jet. So that's not a problem if you are most air forces not having to develop a capacity under fire, because you will have, you can do what the US Air Force does, which is to have, lots of, take most of the people on a given base, do what's called a FOD walk. So everybody just walks up and down the taxiways and the runways 2 or 3 times a day, looking for any bits of anything and picking them up. And as long as you do that and you have smooth, nicely conditioned surfaces, F-16 is very efficient. It's the reason the landing gear is relatively flimsy, and the aircraft's designed the way it is to minimize weight, so to maximize thrust to weight ratio and agility and all of that. The trade-off is in Ukraine. There's quite a lot of work that will need to be done to the air bases that have up to now been being used for and maintained to the standard required for MiG-29 and Sukhoi-27, which are much more FOD tolerant, are twin engine designs with much more robust landing gear, designed to operate from pretty rough strips. And it's not that Ukraine can't prepare strips to that, bases to that level. It's that doing so is not only visible, so you'll see that they've filled in the cracks in the runways or the gaps between runway paving slabs and things, but also that it's quite personnel intensive, and Ukraine is desperately short of trained people for all sorts of tasks. So if you don't do it, if you can only afford to do it at a couple of locations, then the Russians will work out where they are very quickly. And at that point, they will probably go all out to hit them on the ground. And even if they don't hit the jets, to hit the ground support equipment, the maintainers. Ukraine has very effectively used a dispersed operating model for most of the war when they've needed to. So moving jets around regularly from different bases and using forward air bases to conduct rapid refueling and rearming and that kind of thing nearer the front line. All of that is much more difficult to do with F-16. And again, it goes back to the severe overstretch already on Ukrainian ground-based air defenses. If you're also then trying to protect F-16s on the ground from pretty concentrated Russian attacks, that's a pretty big challenge. So I suspect that when they are pushed into theatre, it will be relatively small numbers in order to try and minimize those dangers, or minimize the challenge, minimize the number of personnel that you're having to move around between bases, minimize the target size for the Russians, and so try and potentially disincentivize, the use of massed strikes for a relatively low payoff. But yeah, and in terms of the combat effectiveness, the Ukrainian pilots are some of them are combat experienced, very combat experienced. but they're combat experienced in very different tactics, with using very, very different aircraft that are designed to work in a very different way. And so there will be a question as to how well the aircraft adapt to Ukrainian tactics, can be adapted to Ukrainian tactics, and to what degree the pilots are able and or willing to use Western-style tactics, and whether those Western-style employment methods for aircraft like the F-16 can be integrated with a Ukrainian military that is still very much ground-focused. And so the Air Force is very much a secondary component within the Ukrainian military, as it is in the Russian military. It is a military that is fundamentally run by land officers. And even in the Ukrainian Air Force, a lot of the senior officers are ground-based air defense officers, because Ukraine had a huge ground-based air defense network and has done for many years, and as has essentially saved it from Russian air power for the war so far. All of which is to say there's a lot of questions around how effective relatively small numbers of F-16 will be able to be in country. It's not to suggest that the program isn't useful. It's vital to keep the Ukrainian Air Force extant and to give them capacity for at least internal air defense against cruise, help with cruise missiles and intercepting Shaheds and other things. But I think it's important to manage expectations because they're such a symbol, and because it was such a political priority after main battle tanks, but by the Zelensky government and the Ukrainian military and a lot of the kind of Ukrainian supporting media, social media kind of community, should we say, that there's a really overinflated expectation among most people about what these jets can achieve. F-16 is not a wonder weapon. It is a design from the 1970s that NATO air forces would not employ as the main tool in a threat environment like we see in eastern Ukraine, anywhere near the front lines. And the tactics that you would normally in a Western Air Force use to mitigate some of those limitations are large formation tactics, using a huge number of different weapons in each sortie for suppressive and targeting purposes. And while you can train Ukrainian pilots relatively quickly to fly very quickly to fly the F-16, relatively quickly to operate them individually, training pilots to lead large complex formations, to plan and to actually employ and coordinate in the air, let's say 4-ship tactics, that takes years and years. It takes Western air forces, a minimum of about 3 years, under ideal circumstances, to get people to the point where they're a good 4-ship leader after they join the frontline squadrons. They're already current on type. And we would also normally draw on things like tankers, aerial refueling tankers, to extend the range to give more tactical freedom. The Ukrainians can't operate tankers because of the long-range air defense bubble, so they will have to be at low level with relatively constrained range, because jet engines use a huge amount more fuel at low level, and they'll have to be at low level anywhere near the front lines because of that ground-based long-range surface-to-air threat. So it will help to some degree with air and missile defense in depth, and it will give Ukraine some more options for delivering air-to-ground munitions from some degree of standoff, which they've already been doing to a significant extent with kind of adaptations for use of Western weapons like GBU-62, which is a JDAM glide bomb, from their existing aircraft. But it's not going to change the course of the war.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.